Go fly a kite. Go jump in the lake. Go chase yourself. Go climb a tree. If you understand those phrases, then you'll understand what was happening to Zacchaeus in our passage today. It was a humbling experience for a man who was very wealthy, well-respected. He was willing to humble himself and to climb a tree just so that he could see Jesus. And sometimes you have to climb a tree in order to see Jesus. This is kind of the genre of biblical stories. Seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you. If you are sincerely energetic about finding God and being in a relationship, then you will find. Sometimes those of us in the church do that through service. We volunteer to do things that maybe as we are volunteering to do them, it's like climbing a tree. It's something that's very difficult. Sometimes we learn that in relationships with people who are very different from us. Sometimes that experience comes to us in worship. And worship is where we get a depth of our spiritual life. You lose yourself in something that's so big that you finally find yourself. You know, one of the most disconcerting things that can happen to a person is to not know who they are. If you've ever been in a hospital and you've had anesthetic or you've had a procedure, the first thing that they come in and they ask you, what's your name? Who are you? It's a very disconcerting thing for those people, maybe not to even be able to say that, not to know that. And yet, in a spiritual sense, we really don't know who we are. And that's why the Gospel of Luke calls Zacchaeus a lost person. He's lost because he doesn't really know who he is. And religion basically answers two fundamental questions. Helps you to answer them. The first is, who am I? And the second is, what should I do? Who am I, and what should I do? Now, Zacchaeus, we don't really know what his motivation was, but, he probably had some kind of dissatisfaction with the fact that he was a tax collector. It may have been that worldly things were beginning to tarnish for him, and he was beginning to realize that his life was somewhat empty, and that maybe he was lost, and he didn't really know who he was, and so he was willing to sacrifice his dignity so that he would climb that tree. They make it a point to say that Zacchaeus was short, that he was a tax collector, that he was a sinner, that he was from Jericho. When we were in Bible study this last week, the people who sat around the table as we read this passage, they were brutal in terms of the names that people called them when they were in elementary school. Some of you guys can identify with that. And the world tries to pigeonhole us and tries to put us in a box and tries to delegitimate us by the names that we're called or the place that we're from or the occupation that we have. It's important that this happened in Jericho. Jericho is the place where Cleopatra and Mark Antony used to meet. The name Jericho means Moon City. Doesn't that sound like a good place to vacation? We're going to Moon City. It was known for its fragrance. So here is this tax collector from Moon City, from Jericho, and people already had an opinion of him. This whole band of people who were going along with Jesus. He was a tax collector and very rich, is what it says. And he humbled himself. He made himself look ridiculous because he didn't care about any of those names that he previously had identified with. And this is what Jesus' ministry is all about. This is who Jesus is. To call people to be alive, to call people to look beyond the worldly things that people call you. And the mission of the church is to do exactly what Jesus was doing that day. He was creating caring community. To remind people who they are and what they should do, and to find people who are lost. say in our mission statement for the life of the church, Zacchaeus was ready to embrace and celebrate God's love. Now, pretty often we're timid about asking people to help us. Jesus was pretty bold. He chose bold over mild in his ministry. And he invited himself to dinner at Zacchaeus' house. And if we believe in the mission of helping people to find themselves, helping people to break out of the negative things that have happened to them in life, then we're not timid about that. And we have to bring everyone along, and Jesus knows that. Jesus knows there are some people that his throng won't want to have in the group. And we live also in that same kind of cynical world that Jesus lived in, that Jesus knew about. That world that says something like, we know who people are, and we know that they never change. We know that they can't change. And with all the words that they threw on to Zacchaeus, they pigeonholed him. There are 11 times in the Gospel of Luke where you hear the word today. And I want you to think about the Gospel of Luke today. It starts out with the announcement by the angels. Today, you has been born. This day, a child. The announcement of Jesus' birth. And then, at the crucifixion, the only account of the crucifixion that includes the two thieves on each side, Jesus turns to the one, what we call a righteous criminal. He says, today, you will be with me in paradise. And Jesus reserves that word for these special moments. Today. Choose now or later. Today, you're different. Today, you're a part of what's going on in this movie. What we know about brain science is that we can forget our names, but also that our brains are very pliable, and that sometimes we can very quickly change. And sometimes we change our identity, we make dramatic changes at the snap of a finger. And Zacchaeus, in that moment, he climbed a tree in order to see Jesus. And he found an answer to those two questions. Who is he? And what should he do? Notice in our passage today, Zacchaeus, for some reason or other, probably because of his occupation, he begins with restitution, doesn't he? That's what he thinks change means. Notice that. That he knows that he has a relationship with everyone else. And so he starts talking about restitution. I will pay back 4 times what I have taken. John the Baptist at the Jordan River. People were coming to him and asking him questions. And he had a special question for tax collectors. He said to them, and you tax collectors don't take more than what is owed you. You think that ministry kind of continued on, and maybe Zacchaeus knew about that, and he knew that this Christian movement had to do with fairness? It had to do with community. You know, we talk a lot in America about the stock market, about how important its health is. But the reality is that only 10% of Americans own 80% of the stock market. So most of the people that talk about the gains of the stock market, they don't participate in those gains. And we become cynical. And we believe that Zacchaeus has changed, and we know that he's changed because he does something about it. You can tell that he really knows who he is. You can imagine maybe some of the inner turmoil of Zacchaeus. Maybe when he was leaving a farm where he took taxes away from a poor family. Did he leave that day asking himself the question, who am I? Who am I that I would do these kinds of things? And he was ready to embrace and celebrate God's love. Rabbi Kushner has a book, it's a neat book. It's called When Everything You've Ever Wanted Isn't Enough. And it's a a common spiritual experience. Jesus said it, what does it profit if you gain the whole world and yet lose your soul? What price can you put on your soul? And Martin Luther King Jr., who said our lives begin to end when we become silent about the things that matter. We need a better and a fuller view of life. To realize that today, there's something that I'm not seeing. And like Zacchaeus, we want a better view of that something that we feel out there. Sometimes you have to climb a tree to find Jesus. Sometimes you have to climb a mountain. But in the end, it's the only journey that's worthwhile. To climb out of this world's comfortable, acceptable patterns and negative stereotypes, as Zacchaeus found out. And God was at work in Zacchaeus long before he met Jesus. And God is at work in all of us when we feel this twinge between the person we know we're called to be and the person we are. The world that we know God calls to exist and the world that does exist. And the only question is, how badly do you want to see Jesus? And what tree do you have to climb in order to see him better? Enough to risk something. Enough to make a difference in your life. Enough to find yourself in an undignified position. Enough to change today. Jesus had those really simple words, but they meant a lot.